It was one of those nights where everything felt effortless, the wine flowed freely, and the conversation buzzed around the table with an easy warmth. We were at a small gathering, just a few of our closest friends celebrating a milestone for one of them. Dan and I had been together for 7 years, and this group of people had witnessed every up and down in our relationship. They knew us well, too well, in fact, and somehow that made it feel safe to let go a little. We had been talking about nothing important, just small talk and banter. At one point, someone made a passing comment about how funny it was that I seemed to always be the life of the party, and somehow, it inevitably led to my past relationships. I wasn't ashamed of them, I was proud of where I'd been, of how I had learned and grown. I had always been open about my history, but I didn't often dive deep into it. There were some things, some moments I had to laugh off. Maybe I hid more than I realized. Someone teased me, asking how many people I'd been with before Dan. It wasn't an uncommon question among close friends, though it was something I usually avoided answering directly. But that night, I was feeling bold, carefree. The wine was starting to take effect, and I let out a chuckle, tossing my hair back as I spoke. I've honestly lost count, I joked, raising my glass in mock sincerity. I mean, who's keeping track, right? My friends laughed. A few even shook their heads in disbelief, but they didn't seem offended. It was just a laugh, a casual joke among friends. But I couldn't ignore the sharp glance I saw from Dan out of the corner of my eye. I didn't think much of it at the time, after all, it was all in good fun, wasn't it? But as the night wore on, something shifted. The lightheartedness that had surrounded me felt heavier somehow, like I was wearing a mask I hadn't even realized I'd put on. Dan's responses started to become shorter, his smiles less genuine. He made a couple of comments about how I was always the center of attention, and how nothing ever really changes, but they didn't sound like jokes. I could feel the change in the air, the tension starting to creep in, but I didn't want to acknowledge it, not here, not now. As we drove home later that evening, the quiet between us grew palpable. Normally, we would have laughed about something silly or talked about our day, but tonight there was only silence. The weight of that silence hung around us, settling in the space between us like a thick fog I couldn't see through. I tried to break the ice, but Dan wasn't biting. He didn't seem angry, but there was something in his eyes I couldn't place. It wasn't the carefree look I was used to seeing. This was something different, something heavy. But I pushed it away, convincing myself it was just him being moody. When we got home, I asked him if he was okay. He nodded, but there was no warmth in his gesture. "I'm fine," he said flatly, like he was trying to convince himself more than me. I didn't press him further. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking about how Dan had looked when I made that joke. How, for just a split second, there had been something in his expression, something I couldn't quite identify, that made my stomach turn. The next morning, we went about our usual routine, but everything felt different. It was subtle at first, just little things, the way he avoided eye contact or how he didn't initiate conversation like he normally did. I tried to act normal, pretending like everything was fine, but I could feel the distance between us growing, inch by inch. I told myself it was no big deal. It was just a joke, after all. A careless one, maybe, but nothing to ruin our relationship over. But the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. Something was wrong, and I had no idea how to fix it. What had started as a harmless joke had somehow turned into a crack in the foundation of what I thought was a strong marriage. And I had no idea how deep that crack went. The days following that dinner party felt like a slow unraveling of something I had taken for granted. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just a small bump in the road, nothing to worry about. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something intangible that I couldn't quite grasp. Dan's distance wasn't obvious at first, but it was there, lingering in the spaces between us, like an uninvited guest at a party we were both too polite to acknowledge. The next morning, I woke up to an empty bed. Dan had already left for work, a rarity in our relationship. Normally, he would kiss me goodbye, even if it was just a quick peck. But that morning, there was no kiss, no goodbye, just silence. I told myself he was just busy, that maybe he had a lot on his plate. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I could feel the shift in the air, in the way he looked at me, in the way he barely spoke. The joke I had made, so innocent in the moment, had somehow made him recoil. It was as if he was processing something I couldn't even begin to understand. At lunch, I texted him, asking how his day was going. Normally, he would respond with a quick, witty reply, or share something about his day. Instead, the text sat there, unanswered for hours. When he finally replied, his words were curt, minimal. Fine. Busy. That was it. I wanted to ask him if something was wrong, to confront him about the way he had been acting, but I held back. I didn't want to seem needy or desperate for answers, and I didn't want to start a fight over something as trivial as a joke. So I let it go, or at least, I tried to. By the time he came home that evening, I had convinced myself it was all in my head. Maybe I had overreacted, maybe I was just being paranoid. But as soon as I saw him, that nagging feeling returned. He was still distant, still closed off, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. When we sat down to eat, the silence between us was deafening. We ate our dinner without speaking, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I couldn't remember the last time we had shared a meal like this, where the conversation wasn't flowing, where the silence felt so heavy. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I spoke. Dan, is everything okay? My voice felt small, almost afraid to break the silence that had become so familiar. He glanced at me, but his eyes quickly dropped to his plate, avoiding my gaze. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. And then, in the quietest voice, he said, I don't know. I think you don't get it. His words hung in the air, thick with meaning I couldn't quite decipher. I don't get what? I asked, my heart racing in my chest. But before he could respond, he stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back with a force that startled me. He didn't say another word as he walked to the living room, leaving me sitting there, alone with my thoughts. I couldn't help but feel a wave of frustration wash over me. Why was he acting like this? What had changed? I had tried to make light of everything, tried to cover up my own insecurities with humor, but now it felt like everything I had said and done had come back to haunt me. The tension in our home was palpable, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't escape the feeling that something had been broken. The days following Dan's cold reaction felt like an emotional roller coaster. I tried to keep things normal between us, but the tension was too much to ignore. Every word, every glance, felt loaded with unspoken feelings, and no matter how much I tried to bridge the gap, it only seemed to widen. I couldn't stand the silence any longer. I needed to understand what was going on. It wasn't until the following weekend that I finally broke. I had spent the morning tidying up the house, organizing things, trying to distract myself from the gnawing discomfort that had settled in my chest. The entire time, I could feel his presence in the house, though it seemed like he wasn't truly there. He would walk past me without saying a word, avoid eye contact, and his silence only seemed to deepen with each passing hour. That afternoon, we were sitting in the living room, each of us absorbed in our own little world. I was scrolling through my phone, pretending to be busy while he stared blankly at the television. I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on me, and it was getting unbearable. I wasn't the type to let things fester for long, so I set my phone down and turned to face him. He looked over, his expression unreadable. Dan, we need to talk, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He didn't respond at first, but I saw the flicker of something, maybe annoyance, maybe fatigue, cross his face. About what? He asked, his tone distant, guarded. About us, I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. About how you've been acting since that night. What's going on? He didn't say anything right away, and for a moment, I thought he might not answer at all. But then, he sighed deeply, the sound heavy with frustration. You don't get it, do you? His voice wasn't loud, but there was a hardness to it that I hadn't heard before. Get what? I asked, confused. You think it's all just a joke, he said, his eyes finally meeting mine, though his gaze was sharp, piercing. You think it's okay to just joke about things like that, like I'm some kind of fool. I felt a jolt of surprise, but I stayed calm. Dan, I was just joking. It was nothing serious. You know that. He shook his head, frustration evident in every line of his face. It's not about the joke. It's about how you never take anything seriously. You don't respect me, or our relationship. You just keep making light of everything, like nothing matters. And I'm tired of it. My chest tightened, and I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The shock of his words hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't realized how deeply my jokes had cut him, how they had made him feel less than, insignificant. I had always thought that humor was our way of coping, our way of connecting. But now, it felt like it had become a weapon, one I had unknowingly wielded against him. I don't know what you want me to say, Dan, I finally whispered, the weight of the situation sinking in. I didn't mean to hurt you. He stood up abruptly, his movements sharp. Maybe that's the problem, he said, his voice thick with bitterness. You never mean to hurt me. But you do. Every single time. I stood up too, the tension rising between us, thick and suffocating. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't want to cry, not now, not in front of him. I'm sorry, I said, my voice barely audible. I didn't realize. I didn't know you felt this way. Dan's expression softened, but it wasn't relief. It was something else, sadness, perhaps. You've been so distant lately, he said quietly. And when you joke about your past, about your hookups, it makes me feel like I'm just another guy to you. Like I don't even matter. I could see the pain in his eyes, the vulnerability I had never noticed before. My heart ached for him, for the realization that I had pushed him away without even knowing it. I reached for his hand, but he pulled back. I don't want to fight, I said softly. But I need you to know that I didn't mean to make you feel like that. I love you, and I'm sorry for making you feel like you weren't enough. There was a long silence, and I held my breath, waiting for his response. Finally, he looked at me, his eyes softer now, though the hurt still lingered. I don't know if I can just forget what happened. But maybe we can try to fix this. I nodded, my chest tight with emotion. I want to fix this, too. I don't want to lose you. And for the first time in days, there was a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The weeks after that confrontation felt like a slow, painful rebuilding. Dan and I had taken the first step toward understanding each other, but the road ahead was still unclear. We had agreed to work through things, to talk more openly, but there were days when I felt like we were just going through the motions. I tried to be more mindful of how I spoke, careful not to make jokes that could be misinterpreted, but there was a part of me that still resented the fact that I had to walk on eggshells in my own home. One evening, after a long day at work, I came home to find Dan sitting on the couch, his eyes fixed on his phone. He didn't look up when I walked in, but there was something different in the air, a shift that I couldn't ignore. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him, wondering if this was just another day of pretending everything was fine. I had been planning to take it easy that night, maybe watch a movie or relax with a glass of wine, but instead, I found myself walking toward him. I sat down beside him, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. I glanced at his phone, trying to gauge his mood, but I couldn't read it. He didn't seem angry, but he didn't seem like the man I had married either. Dan, I said softly, breaking the silence. Can we talk? He looked at me then, his gaze warm but tired. About what? About us. About everything. I know things have been tense between us, and I hate it. I don't want to keep feeling like this. I want us to get back to where we were. He sighed, putting his phone down and turning toward me. I don't know if I can just go back to how things were before. I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about. About how I felt, and about how I think I've been too passive in our relationship. I've let things slide, things I shouldn't have. I frowned, surprised by his words. What do you mean? I mean that I've been letting you joke about things that hurt me. Letting you dismiss my feelings. I thought I was just being too sensitive, but the truth is, I've been holding all of this inside, letting it build up until it exploded that night. I nodded, understanding more now than I had before. I get that. And I'm sorry for not realizing sooner how my words were affecting you. I didn't mean to make you feel small. There was a long pause, and for a moment, I felt the weight of everything we had been through. I think I've been trying to protect myself, too, I admitted. I've been so focused on making light of everything, on hiding my own fears, that I didn't see how much it was pushing you away. I've been scared, Dan. Scared of losing you, scared of facing the truth about us. Dan reached for my hand, his grip gentle but firm. I don't want to lose you either. But I can't keep pretending that everything is okay if it's not. We need to be honest with each other, even when it's hard. I squeezed his hand, the weight of his words sinking in. This was the turning point, the moment we both realized that honesty, no matter how painful, was the only way forward. There was no going back to how things were before. But maybe, just maybe, we could build something stronger together. I promise I'll be more open with you, I said quietly. I'll stop hiding behind jokes, and I'll stop pretending like everything's fine when it's not. Dan nodded, his expression softening. And I'll stop shutting down. I'll be better about communicating how I feel, even when it's uncomfortable. We sat there for a while, just holding hands, the silence no longer heavy but peaceful. It wasn't a fix-all solution, but it was a start. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. Maybe we weren't perfect, but we were trying. And that was enough. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but we had finally taken the first step toward healing. And that, for me, was everything. It had been a few months since that turning point, and things between Dan and I had slowly started to change. The conversations that once felt like battlefields had transformed into moments of connection. We were no longer avoiding the tough topics or letting misunderstandings fester in silence. It wasn't perfect, but we were finally learning how to communicate, how to be vulnerable with each other without fear of judgment or rejection. One Saturday afternoon, after a quiet morning of doing chores around the house, I sat down on the couch with a cup of coffee, staring out the window. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a sense of clarity that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just about what we had been through or the things we'd said to each other. It was about the realization that we were stronger than we had believed. We had been through the storm, and now we were learning how to find calm in the aftermath. Dan walked into the living room, looking tired but content. He smiled when he saw me sitting there, lost in thought. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his voice warm. I looked up at him, a small smile tugging at my lips. I was just thinking about how far we've come. How much we've learned about each other. He sat down beside me, reaching for my hand. Yeah. It's been a hell of a journey, hasn't it? I nodded, squeezing his hand. But we made it through. And I think we're finally getting it right. Dan chuckled softly, rubbing his thumb over the back of my hand. I don't know if we'll ever get it completely right, but I'm willing to keep trying. I'm willing to fight for us. My heart swelled at his words, and for the first time in a long time, I truly believed him. We had both made mistakes. We had both hurt each other in ways we didn't fully understand at the time. But we had also grown, together, in a way that I never thought possible. I'm sorry for making you feel like you weren't enough, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I didn't realize how much that hurt you, how much my jokes and my distance pushed you away. Dan turned to face me, his eyes soft but serious. And I'm sorry for not speaking up sooner, for letting things build up until they exploded. I should have told you how I was feeling before it got that bad. We both sat in silence for a moment, just taking in the weight of everything we had shared. Then, Dan leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to my forehead. "I love you," he said quietly. The words were simple, but they meant everything. I had heard them countless times before, but now, in this moment, they felt different. More real. More grounded. "I love you too," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. We didn't need grand gestures or dramatic moments to prove our love. We had already been through enough to know that love wasn't just about the easy moments. It was about the hard ones, the times when we felt lost or broken or unsure. It was about showing up, even when we didn't have all the answers. And that's what we had learned, that love isn't perfect, but it's worth fighting for. It's worth putting in the effort, even when it's hard. As long as we were both willing to do that, we could face whatever came our way. For the first time in a long time, I felt peace settle in my chest. We had found our way back to each other, and no matter what the future held, we would face it together.